It was the kind of night small towns dream about. The kind of night where the air is heavy with lilac blooms, and the quiet hum of cicadas blends with the distant thump of a high school gym's rented speakers. June 1990. The last day of school had given way to the first breath of summer, and for the seniors of Marlow High, it was their final dance before adulthood took them by the hand and pulled them apart. The street outside the school was a constellation of headlights, chrome bumpers reflecting the orange pools of light from the lampposts. Boys in crisp tuxedos leaned against cars they had borrowed from older brothers. Girls in dresses that took weeks to choose and hours to put on floated across the parking lot like small, bright planets in orbit. Laughter spilled from every doorway, but so did secrets, those quick conspiratorial glances exchanged between friends who knew things the grown-ups didn't. And in the middle of it all, Clara Whitfield. Her lavender satin dress shimmered like moonlight on still water. Every step she took seemed to catch the light differently. Sometimes silver, sometimes pale blue, sometimes the softest violet you could imagine. Her hair was pinned in loose curls that brushed her shoulders, and her eyes, people would later say, carried something far away in them, like she was already looking past the walls of the gym, past the town itself. Everyone knew Clara. Not just because she was one of the prettiest girls in her year, but because she carried herself as if she didn't quite belong to the noise around her. There was a gentleness to the way she moved, a quiet in the way she spoke. She wasn't the type to crave the spotlight, but that night it seemed to find her anyway. Her best friend Julie recalled years later how Clara kept checking her watch. How she excused herself twice from the dance floor, stepping into the hallway and staring out through the glass doors at the parking lot. She told me she was fine, Julie said in a recorded interview, but she said it in that way people do when they're not. Her prom date, Matthew Harris, remembered something else, that she kept touching the little silver locket around her neck. He'd asked what was inside once, weeks before, and she told him, nothing important. But that night, she wouldn't let go of it. When the slow song came on, a syrupy ballad the DJ had played at every school dance since 7th grade, Clara swayed in Matthew's arms, but her gaze was fixed on the far doors. He thought she was just looking for friends. He didn't know she was memorizing the way out. There's an image burned into the memory of more than one classmate. Clara standing at the edge of the parking lot, around 11:45 p.m., clutch in hand, her dress hem catching in the breeze. She turned once, glanced back toward the gym's glowing windows, and then stepped into the shadows beyond the last lamppost. In a town like Marlow, nothing feels dangerous until it's already too late. That night, nobody thought they were seeing the last of her. Nobody thought they should follow. But by morning, Clara Whitfield would be gone. And the lavender dress that had shimmered so beautifully under the streetlights would be buried deep in the soil of someone else's garden, its story hidden, waiting decades to be unearthed. The morning after prom, the town woke to sunlight that felt too bright. The rain from earlier in the week had dried, leaving the streets clean, the lawns green, and the air deceptively peaceful. Marlow was the kind of place where people believed they could read the weather in a neighbor's eyes, where you didn't expect bad news before breakfast. At 7:12 a.m., Clara's mother, Evelyn, picked up the phone to call Julie's house. Her tone was casual at first, just checking to see if Clara had spent the night there. The pause on the other end was longer than she expected. No, she didn't come here. Evelyn's first thought wasn't that something had happened. It was that Clara, in some burst of teenage spontaneity, had gone to another friend's house. But by the third call and the third repetition of, "No, I haven't seen her," the morning shifted. By 8:30, Matthew Harris was at the Whitfields' kitchen table, pale and restless. He said he'd last seen Clara just before midnight. She had told him she was going to get some air. He stayed behind, thinking she'd return. She didn't. Outside, Evelyn noticed the car still in the driveway. Clara had no license yet. She never learned to drive, but she'd have at least called for a ride. That was the kind of girl she was. By noon, the small police station on Main Street had a file open under the name Clara Whitfield. The word missing wasn't stamped in red across the top yet, but the tone in the room had already shifted from she'll turn up to something's wrong. Deputy Raines took the first drive around the high school grounds. The parking lot was empty except for a few cigarette butts, some discarded cups, and near the far drainage ditch, a single lavender pump heel snapped off. It lay on its side, mud staining the satin. Rains picked it up with 2 fingers, already knowing whose it was. By late afternoon, whispers were moving faster than the search. In the bakery, 2 women swore they'd seen Clara at the gas station around 1 a.m., standing with some man they couldn't name. At the hardware store, someone claimed they'd heard she was seen walking toward the train tracks. Every version came with its own grain of certainty, but none of it lined up. That evening, Evelyn and her ex-husband Charles, who had driven 6 hours from the next state over, stood on the front porch as the sheriff gave them his practiced but hollow reassurance. "We'll find her." His eyes, however, betrayed the weight of too many cases where that wasn't true. By the second night, the street where Clara lived had become a patchwork of flashlight beams and porch lights left burning. Neighbors searched the edges of their yards, the ditches, the old barn behind the Whitfield's house. Evelyn walked the same block again and again, as if Clara might suddenly appear under the amber glow of the street lamp. But she didn't. And somewhere between the first and second night, the people of Marlow realized the unthinkable. This wasn't a prank or a runaway story. Clara Whitfield had stepped out into the shadows after prom, and simply never stepped back. By the third day, Marlow no longer felt like a town. It felt like a stage, lit only by beams of white light sweeping over fields, yards, and the dark edges of the river. Search parties formed faster than the sheriff's department could coordinate them. Fathers in work boots walked shoulder to shoulder with high school athletes, raking through the tall grass with wooden poles. Mothers clutched flashlights in one hand and printed copies of Clara's senior photo in the other. The image, her smile just shy of serious, her hair tucked behind her ears, was taped to the front windows of every business on Main Street. The hum of helicopters became the background noise of summer. From above, their spotlights dragged across the earth, illuminating patches of ground for only seconds before sliding away into the darkness. From below, the effect was almost dreamlike, bright cones of light cutting through mist, revealing the brief flash of a fence post, the curve of an old truck hood, the startled eyes of a deer. Everyone remembered the moment the search moved from hopeful to desperate. It happened when the divers went into the river. The river had always been both a playground and a warning. In the daylight, it was where families picnicked, kids skipped stones, and fishermen stood waist-deep in waders. At night, it became something else. Deep, slow-moving, and full of shadows that swallowed the moonlight. When the divers emerged after hours in the black water, shaking their heads, something in the town's collective spirit shifted. The sheriff kept the official statements calm. "We're following all leads. There's no evidence of foul play yet." But his deputies were no longer using Clara's name casually. They spoke in clipped sentences. They stayed longer after shifts. In the middle of all this, certain figures began to stand out. There was Julie, Clara's best friend, who hadn't slept more than a few hours since the disappearance. She clung to the idea that Clara had left for a reason, that she would call any day now explaining it all. She joined every search group she could, walking miles with blistered feet. In one televised interview, her voice cracked when she said, "She wouldn't just leave me here without saying goodbye." There was Sheriff Dawes, who had known Clara since she was a toddler, when her father brought her to the station to see the Christmas tree they decorated for the kids. He walked the same trails the volunteers did, but his gaze was different. Measuring, scanning for the things others might miss. And there was Harold Bixby, a farmer on the edge of town, who told anyone who would listen that he'd seen her the night she vanished. Barefoot, walking along the shoulder of County Road 14, heading toward the highway. His sighting was never confirmed, and some dismissed him as a man who just wanted to be part of the story. But his detail that her dress was dragging in the dirt lingered in people's minds. Theories bloomed like weeds. Some believed she had run away, chasing a bigger life beyond Marlow. Others whispered about a stalker. A few clung to the hope she was hiding, maybe from someone they all knew but didn't suspect. Night after night, the town kept looking. Searchlights swept the edges of the woods. Porch lights stayed on long past midnight. Dogs barked at the rustle of leaves, and every shadow seemed to take on a human shape. By the end of that first week, one truth had set in for everyone. Clara Whitfield had become the center of Marlow's world. And until she was found, nothing else would matter. In the weeks after Clara's disappearance, the searchlights dimmed, but the voices began. The police station's back room became a revolving door. Friends, classmates, Teachers and neighbors called in, one by one. The sound of the tape recorder clicking on was followed by the same opening question. When was the last time you saw Clara Whitfield? What emerged wasn't a single, clean thread, but a tangle of contradictions. Matthew Harris, her prom date, insisted she was in good spirits that night. She was smiling, laughing, we were dancing. She didn't seem scared. But then he paused, looking at the table, admitting she did step away twice without saying where she was going. Once she returned with her clutch, the other time without it. He said he never asked why. Julie told a different story. She kept checking the clock, like she was waiting for someone. She told me she was fine, but she wasn't. Julie's voice caught as she described the last moment she saw Clara, standing near the gym doors, touching the locket at her neck. She always did that when she was nervous, Julie said. She didn't know I noticed. Then there was Mrs. Carver, a waitress at the diner off Route 6. She swore she'd seen Clara 2 weeks before prom, sitting in a booth with a man much older than her. They weren't laughing, Mrs. Carver said. They were talking low, serious-like. She looked down at the table most of the time. She remembered the man's hands, big with a scar across the knuckles. A teacher from the English department added yet another layer. He recalled Clara's grades slipping in the spring and her sudden reluctance to participate in class. It wasn't like her, he said. She seemed distracted, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. Even the night of prom itself refused to settle into one agreed-upon version. A sophomore girl claimed she saw Clara leaving with someone in a dark sedan. A junior said she was standing alone by the bike racks, looking out toward the street. A man who lived across from the school insisted he saw her walking toward the old gas station just before midnight. Each account was vivid in its own way, but none overlapped cleanly. The sheriff kept the most promising ones close, locking the tapes in a drawer. The rest filtered into the rumor mill, where details twisted, merged, and grew sharper in retelling. For the people of Marlow, these interviews became more than evidence. They became part of the town's folklore. The diner sighting, the dark sedan, the barefoot walk along the road. Each detail was a thread, and everyone pulled at the ones they believed in most. But in the quiet of the investigation room, away from the gossip and speculation, there was an unspoken fear among the deputies. Too many stories meant too few truths. And somewhere inside those contradictions, Clara Whitfield had disappeared completely. August in Marlow was the kind of heat that made the air shimmer. 3 months had passed since prom night, and while the search had grown quieter, it hadn't ended. People still glanced over their shoulders when walking home after dark, still locked their doors before sunset, still spoke Clara's name in hushed tones. It was on one such blistering afternoon that Mrs. Ruth Miller knelt in her backyard, hands buried in the soil of her vegetable garden. She'd been pulling weeds between the tomato vines when her trowel struck something solid. At first, she thought it was a stone. But as she scraped away the dirt, the surface felt wrong. Soft in places, stiff in others, like fabric that had been left out in the rain for too long. She tugged, and the soil loosened to reveal a flash of pale lavender. Sequins caught the sunlight for the briefest moment before being swallowed again by the shadow of her hands. Ruth froze. The image of the missing posters flickered in her mind. The photo of Clara, the careful description of her prom dress. Without another touch, she stood and walked inside, her palms trembling as she dialed the sheriff's office. Within 20 minutes, the backyard was a crime scene. Yellow tape fluttered in the heavy air as deputies moved in measured steps. Neighbors gathered at the edges of the lawn, whispering, their eyes darting between the hole in the garden and the quiet, grim faces of the officers. The dress was folded. Not crumpled, not torn. Folded almost carefully, like someone had meant for it to rest there. The fabric was caked in dirt, but here and there, the lavender still showed through, soft and ghost-like. The hem was stained dark, and the bodice still held the faint outline of a body that had worn it. No shoes. No jewelry. Just the dress. The soil beneath it was turned over more than once. It wasn't deep enough to have been meant for permanent hiding, but it was deliberate. The deputies worked slowly, sifting for any other trace of Clara. Hair, fabric, bone, but found nothing. The house the garden belonged to had been rented for decades by an older man named Edward Bellamy, who'd moved to a nursing home just a month earlier. He wasn't there to explain why, in all his years of gardening, something like this had gone unnoticed, or why it was there at all. The discovery didn't bring relief. It brought a new kind of fear. The search for Clara had been for a person. Now it was for the truth of a scene someone had tried to bury. That night, under the dim porch light of the Miller home, Ruth told a local reporter in a trembling voice, "I planted tomatoes there every year. I never saw a thing until today. And now I keep thinking, what if it had been more than just her dress?" The town's heartbeat, which had slowed over the summer, began to pound again. And for the first time since prom night, people started to believe they might be closer to answers. Answers that had been hiding in plain sight, under a stranger's garden. The house on Maple Hollow Road had always been odd. Not derelict, not haunted, looking in the storybook sense. Just quiet in a way that made people notice. Its shutters were always drawn, even in summer. The lawn was kept trimmed but never manicured. No children played there. No one could recall the sound of music or laughter drifting from its windows. It belonged to Edward Bellamy, a man who had lived in Marlow longer than most but was somehow still considered an outsider. He had been a young man when he bought the property in 1964, and in the decade since, his presence in town was defined by absence. He shopped at odd hours, spoke little beyond polite nods, and seemed to prefer the company of his garden to that of his neighbors. Those who remembered him from younger days said he once worked at the freight depot on the edge of town, though no one could pinpoint when he left the job or why. Rumors said he'd never married. Others claimed he had, but that she'd left in the night, back in the 70s, and was never seen again. When Bellamy was moved to the county nursing home, a month before the garden discovery, the house sat empty for the first time in over 20 years. No one expected the ground behind it to hold a secret. The sheriff's department treated the backyard like a puzzle, combing every inch for clues. They searched the shed, its floorboards warped with age. They sifted through boxes in the attic, most containing nothing but old tools, stacks of yellowed newspapers, and jars of nails. In the basement, dust lay thick as felt. Neighbors who once passed the house without a thought now remembered every uneasy glance. There was the retired postman, who said Bellamy often received letters with no return address. Small, plain envelopes that he tucked quickly into his jacket. There was Marla Jenkins, who swore she'd seen him digging in the garden at 2 in the morning one summer. His face lit only by a single hanging bulb over the back porch. And there were the teenagers who dared each other to sprint past his property at night, claiming they'd seen a figure in the upstairs window, even after the lights went out. Nothing about Bellamy's record screamed violence. An old citation for trespassing in the late 70s, a dispute over a fence line in 82, a public disturbance ticket after an argument in the grocery store parking lot. But there was a thread that made the deputies uneasy, a pattern of presence in the margins of other people's lives. He never crossed a line that could be proven, but he was always near it. The lavender dress in his garden made the past tilt. What had once been dismissed as eccentricity now looked like camouflage. Investigators questioned him at the nursing home. His health was fragile. Thin frame, sunken eyes, a tremor in his hands. When asked about the dress, his voice was faint, his answers clipped. He claimed no knowledge of it, suggested it must have been buried there after he'd already left. But when pressed on whether he ever knew Clara, he hesitated just a fraction too long. For the people of Marlow, the house became a character in the story, its drawn shutters like closed eyes, its locked doors holding back whatever it had seen. Parents pulled their children closer when walking past. And in whispered conversations at the diner, the same question returned again and again. If the dress was there, what else had been? Before she vanished, Clara Whitfield's life looked, at least from the outside, like the kind people assumed was safe. She lived with her mother, Evelyn, in a small blue house on Ashford Street, the kind with wind chimes on the porch and a bird feeder in the yard. Her father, Charles, had moved to Indiana after the divorce, visiting when he could, sending postcards in his careful block handwriting. She sang in the church choir, worked weekends at the local bakery, and was voted most likely to brighten your day in the senior yearbook. But photographs lie, and so do polite smiles. As the investigation deepened, detectives began piecing together small, easily overlooked moments from Clara's last months. Moments that, when placed side by side, formed a different picture entirely. Her grades, steady all through high school, had slipped that spring. Her English teacher remembered her staring out the window during class, her notebook open but untouched. At the bakery, a coworker said she'd stopped chatting with regulars, instead vanishing into the back room between customers. There were the small acts of withdrawal, turning down invitations, skipping a shift at choir practice, not showing up for movie nights with Julie. None of it seemed alarming at the time. Teenage moods were just that, moods. But now, in the harsh light of hindsight, they felt like early warnings. Then came the diary. Found in the bottom drawer of her nightstand, it was small, leather-bound, and locked with a clasp. Evelyn gave it to the police without opening it. When they did, they found a girl's voice that wavered between light and shadow. Some entries were ordinary notes about a good grade on a paper, a joke a customer told at the bakery, what song was stuck in her head. Others were not. March 12th. I feel like someone's watching me after work. It's probably nothing, but I keep crossing the street just in case. April 5th. Julie keeps asking if I'm okay. I want to tell her, but I don't want her to be scared. May 16th. He said it's the last time. I hope he's telling the truth. And then, from the week before prom, I hope Friday ends the way I need it to. The words were like a bruise, small, but deep enough to ache every time you pressed on them. Detectives couldn't be sure who he was. The diary never named him, and none of the entries made it clear whether Clara felt threatened, trapped, or simply conflicted. But the tone, the way her handwriting seemed hurried in certain passages, spoke of tension. To the public, none of this was revealed. Official statements stuck to facts, but inside the investigation, there was a growing sense that Clara's disappearance wasn't the sudden snatching the town imagined. It might have been the endpoint of a quiet unraveling that no one had noticed until it was too late. And as one investigator later admitted off record, when I read those pages, I didn't just feel like she was gone. I felt like she'd been leaving for a while. By late August, the case had stopped being a search and started being a map. One covered in photographs, timelines, and red ink notes pinned to the corkboard in the sheriff's office. 3 faces emerged as the centerpieces of that map. 3 men, each with a thread connecting them, however faint, to the night Clara Whitfield disappeared. 1. Edward Bellamy, the man with the garden. The lavender dress buried behind his house was proof enough to keep him at the top of the suspect list, though he denied knowing Clara beyond seeing her around town. His history, quiet, solitary, shadowed by odd behavior, gave people reasons to believe more. Detectives noted the small details: a shovel in his shed with soil that didn't match the rest of his yard, a stack of old newspaper clippings about other missing women in rural areas, a set of keys in his desk drawer, none of which matched any door in his house. He had no alibi for prom night, claiming he went to bed early. The problem was, no one could confirm whether that was true. 2. The older coworker Clara's part-time job at the diner introduced her to a man named Frank Dwyer, in his early 30s, who worked the late shift as a short-order cook. Frank had a reputation: friendly enough with customers but quick to temper in the kitchen. A waitress recalled seeing Clara and Frank talking in the alley behind the diner one evening in May. It wasn't a flirtation, she said. It looked like an argument. Frank claimed they were just sorting out a schedule conflict. But Mrs. Carver, the other diner waitress, swore Frank matched the description of the man with scarred knuckles she'd seen Clara with weeks before prom. When questioned, Frank admitted he had given her rides home a few times after late shifts. He insisted it was harmless. Detectives didn't like the timeline. One of those rides happened just 2 nights before prom. 3. The man in the parking lot. Multiple students mentioned a dark sedan idling near the far end of the high school parking lot that night. One junior described the driver as mid-40s, wearing a cap, though she never saw his face clearly. No one came forward to claim they had been in that car. No one could recall its license plate. Then, in September, a tip came from a gas station clerk in a neighboring county. He remembered seeing a car that matched the description around midnight on prom night. He thought the driver was waiting for someone, the way his eyes kept flicking toward the road. The car was never found. As the documentary voice lingers on these profiles, the tension shifts. The audience is given pieces but no solid ground to stand on. Each man could be dangerous. Each could be innocent. The sheriff's department chased all three leads, but every time they pushed hard enough to expect a crack, they hit walls. Alibis that almost held, witnesses who grew unsure, and evidence that blurred instead of sharpened. And in a case where the most physical clue was a dress buried in a garden, the shadows each suspect cast seemed to grow longer the more they were chased. In the weeks that followed, the public took sides. Some were certain Bellamy was guilty. Others swore Frank Dwyer had a temper that could turn lethal. A few whispered about the parking lot driver as if he were some ghostly figure who drifted in and out of town to collect his victims. For the investigators, the problem wasn't a lack of suspects. It was that each of them seemed to fit the kind of story everyone feared, but not the one that could be proven. Long before Clara vanished, the Marlow River had been a place of stories. By day, it was harmless enough, a slow, winding stretch of water cutting through fields and backwoods, its banks dotted with fishing spots and picnic tables. Children learned to swim in its shallows. Couples carved their initials into the wooden rail of the old footbridge. But at night, the river belonged to someone else. It moved differently then, the current taking on a hushed, deliberate pull. Locals spoke of it like a living thing, patient, watchful, and always willing to take what fell into it. Every few years, it would offer something back, a deer carcass caught in the reeds, an old bicycle rusted to orange, the half-submerged shell of a rowboat from decades past. And sometimes it gave nothing at all. When Clara disappeared, it didn't take long for the search to turn toward the water. The sheriff called in divers from the next county. For 3 days, they swept the riverbed, their bodies disappearing beneath the surface, air bubbles marking their progress. They found scraps of debris, beer cans, fishing lures, twisted wire, but no sign of a girl in a lavender dress. The river gave nothing that summer. Still, it became part of the town's collective theory, a place to point to when no other answer felt big enough to hold the truth. Parents warned their children away from its banks after dark. Teenagers dared each other to walk the footbridge at midnight. And when people spoke about Clara in hushed tones at the diner, someone inevitably said, "If she's anywhere, she's there." Years later, the river would be woven into her legend the way shadows are woven into dusk. Not because anyone saw her go into it, but because it seemed like the kind of place that could erase someone, and then keep the secret forever. Time has a strange way of behaving in a small town after a tragedy. It moves forward, but it doesn't leave. For the Marlow High School class of 1990, prom night became a frozen photograph in their lives, one that refused to fade, no matter how many other memories came after it. Reunions were the hardest. At the 5-year mark, they gathered in the gym again, now lit with fluorescent lights instead of twinkling ones. They hugged, they swapped stories, they laughed over old yearbook photos. But there was always an empty space in the group pictures. Someone would make a quiet joke to break the tension. Clara's just running late, but no one laughed very hard. By the 10th reunion, the jokes had stopped. The lavender ribbon they tied to a chair in her honor was a small, silent acknowledgement. She wasn't just missing from the night, she was missing from their futures. Some carried the weight more than others. Julie never left Marlow. She married young, divorced quietly, and still walked the same sidewalks she and Clara had strolled as teenagers. She admitted once to a local paper that she couldn't drive past the high school without looking toward the spot where she'd last seen her best friend. "It's like she's still there," she said. "Like if I just walk fast enough, I could catch her before she steps into the dark." Matthew Harris left town for college, but came back less than a year later, restless and withdrawn. He worked at his father's hardware store, kept mostly to himself, and avoided prom season entirely. "It's not for me," he'd say when asked, but everyone knew why. Even Sheriff Dawes carried it. He retired with a clean record, but admitted in private that Clara's case was the one that kept him up at night. Every time the phone rang past midnight, he said, "I hoped it was someone telling me we'd found her." The story became a rite of passage in Marlow. Teenagers who hadn't been born when Clara vanished still knew her name, still whispered her story at sleepovers, still imagined what it would have been like to be at that prom. They spoke of it as if the night had never ended, as if somewhere Clara was still standing at the edge of the parking lot, clutch in hand, deciding whether to walk into the light or the dark. And so the prom became a ghost, not just the memory of music and laughter, but the place where youth stopped for everyone who had been there. A night that shimmered and then broke, leaving its pieces scattered across decades. It was 25 years after Clara Whitfield vanished when the phone rang in the Marlow Sheriff's office. By then, the case file had been moved to the cold shelf, its folders thick with dust, the lavender dress sealed in an evidence bag like a ghost pressed between glass. The call came from a nurse at Rosehill Nursing Home in the next county over. One of her patients, an elderly man named Edward Bellamy, had something he wanted to say before he died. Sheriff Dawes was long retired by then, but he came in anyway. The younger deputies didn't need to be told twice. If Bellamy was ready to talk, they would be there with the recorder running. Bellamy was frail when they found him. Skin like paper, voice a low rasp. The oxygen tube in his nose hissed softly as he spoke. At first, he didn't say Clara's name. He spoke in fragments, as if the story weighed more than his failing lungs could carry. "She came to me," he whispered. "Not the way you think. She was scared of someone else." He claimed he let her stay in his house that night, prom night, because she didn't feel safe going home. He said they talked in the kitchen, that she cried but wouldn't tell him the full story. "I told her I'd keep her safe," he murmured. "I meant it." When asked what happened next, his gaze drifted toward the window. His voice grew fainter. "She wanted to leave, but I couldn't let her go. Not back to him." Who him was, Bellamy never said. When pressed, he shook his head, eyes glistening. He said she wasn't herself by morning, that she slept most of the day, and that it was better this way when she didn't wake up. But there were no specifics. No cause of death, no admission of violence. He insisted he buried only her dress, because "I couldn't put her in the ground." Couldn't. And then, with a faint smile that chilled the room, he added, "Someone worse would have taken her if I didn't. That's all you need to know." Within a week, Bellamy was dead. The confession was maddening, enough to suggest guilt, but too vague to close the case. It matched details only the killer could know, like the way the dress was folded and the fact that Clara had taken off her shoes before leaving the gym, but it left the most crucial truth unspoken: where her body was. The town split in its reaction. Some believed Bellamy completely, that he had been the sole figure behind her disappearance. Others thought he was protecting someone else, even in his last breath. And a few whispered the most unsettling theory of all, that he had told the truth, but that the someone worse was still alive. For the Whitfield family, it was another wound disguised as closure. Evelyn said in a rare interview, "We know who he was, but we still don't know where she is." That's not an ending. The garden has long since grown back. The bare patch where the deputies dug in August 1990 is now a tangle of tomato vines and marigolds. New owners live in the house unaware, or perhaps unwilling to dwell on, the fact that beneath this same soil, a lavender prom dress once slept for 3 silent months. Every spring, the ground blooms. Sunlight falls across the same earth that once hid the most visible piece of Clara Whitfield's life. And every spring, the town remembers. The dress is still locked away in the sheriff's evidence room. Its fabric, though dulled by soil and time, still catches the light in small ways. It is the only piece of her that was ever brought back from the dark, a cruel relic, proof that she existed, but not proof of where she went. For Evelyn, that dress is both a comfort and a curse. She's seen it only once since the day it was found. She said it smelled faintly of earth, but underneath, she swore she caught the ghost of her daughter's perfume. She told the deputies to keep it. "If you ever find the rest of her," she said, "she should be wearing it." Bellamy's death left the official story unfinished. His words are the last recorded link to Clara, but they lead nowhere, like a road swallowed by fog. Some believe the truth lies in a river, waiting for the right current to bring it up. Others think it's buried far from Marlow, in a place no one has thought to look. And then there are those who believe she is still out there in some way. Not alive, but present. In the hush before a thunderstorm. In the scent of lilacs on the air. In the shimmer of a dress at the edge of a memory. The night Clara vanished was supposed to be a celebration. A final dance before life scattered her and her friends into adulthood. Instead, it became a story that would bind the town together for decades. Not in joy, but in the quiet, shared ache of an unanswered question. Some stories end with justice. Others with closure. Clara Whitfield's ends with soil and a garden. and a dress that still remembers the way it moved when she danced. And in Marlow, on warm summer nights, if you stand in the right spot in the parking lot outside the high school gym, you can almost see her, turning once, glancing back toward the lights, before stepping into the shadows that never gave her back.